Der folgende Vortrag wurde im Rahmen des GSiK-Programms angeboten. GSiK ist ein interdisziplinäres Lehrprojekt der Universität Würzburg, das es ermöglicht, sich über Studienfachgrenzen hinweg weiterzubilden. Wir stellen den Vortrag öffentlich zur Verfügung, um ihn für mehr Menschen zugänglich zu machen. Punkte für GSiK können wir leider nur bei Anwesenheit während der tatsächlichen Veranstaltung vergeben. Wir bitten dafür um Ihr Verständnis und wünschen Ihnen nun einen spannenden Vortrag.
So I'm going to talk to you this evening about, as you heard, the fragile state of democracy in the United States and in Europe, and with some reflections about how to fix it. I don't know if I can fix it, but exactly how to fix it, but we'll get to this at the end. So I'm a scholar of comparative politics, and I study democracy around the world, as well as the history of democracy. And I'm going to use that comparative perspective this evening to think about what's happened in the United States over the past 10 years and what lessons and warnings there are from that for Germany, for Europe. And I think I'm going to make the case that there are things we can learn from the American experience for Europe. But I want to also say that by the end, I'll come back to possibly some positive lessons that we can also learn from the United States in the effort to push back against democratic backsliding over the past year. But I thought I would begin with some statistics, with some numbers. I am a political scientist after all. And I'll just note by saying that there's a perception that democracy is under siege around the world. That's correct. The Varieties of Democracy Institute that some of you may know about, that's based out of Sweden, in its most recent report in 2026, gave a very grim assessment of the state of democracy in the world and reported that the percentage of people living in authoritarian systems in the world has increased from 50% in 2005 to 74% today. The Varieties of Democracy report also reports that the world is only as democratic as it was in the mid-1970s. So in other words, all of the advances that were made in the so-called third wave of democracy that began in the 1970s have been reversed, according to Varieties of Democracy. Now, I have to say, as worried as I am about the state of democracy, and I have spent the last 10 years of my life studying this, I actually think that the Varieties of Democracy report is overstating the problem. And it's a little misleading, the way they report this. Now, again, I understand, I think we face serious problems, and this may be a kind of small methodological technical point, but I think it's worth dwelling on, so bear with me for a moment. So the way that the report says that we are in as bad a state as we were in the 1970s is by reporting the percentage of the world's population who live in non-democratic systems. In other words, the analysis is the number of people. Now, that's one way of reporting this, and part of the reason there's such bad numbers, the percentage of people in the world living in non-democracies, is there's some very large countries that have experienced democratic backsliding. India, the United States, Brazil to some degree as well. So this is in part why they come to this dire conclusion. In the past, this same organization, the Varieties of Democracy, used to report the percentage of countries in the world that have experienced democratic backsliding. And I think actually this is also a very useful indicator. And the reason it's important to talk about the percentage of countries rather than the percentage of people living in authoritarian systems is by saying that there's a global wave of de-democratization. This leads us to misinterpret what's happening. Because in fact, democratic backsliding is asymmetric. There's some countries where democracy remains resilient. There's also some countries where democracy is backsliding. And I think this matters a lot because we not only need to focus on the countries that are experiencing democratic backsliding, but we also need to focus on the countries where democracy is resilient. Because if we want to learn lessons about how to maintain resilience, we need to focus on both the positive and the negative cases. So democracy has stumbled in some places, but it's also endured in others. And by lumping them all together and reporting a single global percentage, we actually obscure the fact that this is unevenly distributed. The crisis of democracy is unevenly distributed. Most wealthy democracies have actually stood up against this challenge. Most old democracies have stood up against this challenge. Now, I have to say there's one major exception, and that's the country that I'm from. There's a rich, old democracy where democracy has backslid, and that is the United States. Let me give you some more numbers. So again, be patient with me. The Freedom House organization produces a global freedom index every year, and it assigns, so for the political scientists here, you'll know this, it assigns every country in the world a score of 0 to 100, 100 being a full democracy, 0 being a full autocracy. For decades, the United States had a score of 94, which put it in the same league as Germany, Canada, Great Britain. Beginning in 2016, in fact, it had a score of 94. Today, the US's score has fallen to 81, which puts it alongside the same score as Romania and Mongolia, and 2 points below Argentina. It's on par with Jamaica and Suriname, far behind most West European democracies, or all West European democracies. Now, this is worth noting. The class of countries that these are other rich old democracies have endured, although facing serious challenges. The United States has not, has experienced genuine democratic backsliding. Now, you all probably can think about the reasons why the U.S. has dropped. I mean, the reason Freedom House has given this lower score, number one, there was a contested transfer of power in January 2021, on January 6, 2021. There have been systematic efforts to make it harder to vote. We've also seen attacks on core democratic institutions, including on universities, research institutions, essential bulwarks of democracy. In the last year in particular, the federal government has been weaponized to go after political opponents of the president. There's been the mistaken and sometimes even intentional arrest of U.S. citizens under the cover of efforts to find illegal immigrants. And of course, 2 U.S. citizens were shot in the streets by immigration authorities in Minneapolis earlier this year. You add to all of this efforts to make it harder for the opposition party to win elections by tilting the electoral playing field. You've probably heard about the gerrymandering process in the United States that make elections less competitive. There's a lot more one could say, but all of this is serious democratic backsliding in a rich old democracy. And one thing I'll also say is that, in terms of trying to understand what kind of regime this is, sometimes people use the word fascism. I'm not sure if that's the right term. I think in many ways, actually, we can draw upon the German sociologist Max Weber, who had a concept of patrimonialism, which is the notion that a government is sort of in the hands of a single leader who treats government as his own personal household. I think in many ways, the Trump administration looks like a patrimonial regime, where he just uses his own private money to tear down part of the White House and rebuild it. And it sort of, in some ways, has a kind of patrimonial tendency, where personal loyalty to the president is more important than the rule of law, where public interest and private interest get blurry. So whatever one calls it, the point is, according to all of the major indices, America has experienced democratic backsliding. Now, the fact that this has happened really is, from a social scientific point of view, very surprising, because there's 2 things that social scientists agree on. They often disagree about a lot of things, but there's 2 things they agree on. And as I said before, one is that rich democracies never die. Based on the past century of data, no democracy remotely as rich as the United States has ever broken down. So that's the first point. A second point is old democracies never die. Taking the past century of data, no democracy over the age of 50 has ever broken down. The US is in fact 4 times richer than any democracy that has broken down in the past 100 years, and it's also much older. So in this sense, the crisis of democracy in the United States represents a real puzzle for social scientists. This is really not supposed to happen according to our theories. Unique among its peer nations, again, Western Europe, East Asia, the US is the only one that's experienced democratic backsliding. So the puzzle, to come back to the initial question, is why is this happening? And so what I wanted to do is tell you about 2 different factors that I think have played a very important role. And I think there are lessons in that diagnosis for Europe. Now, as we all know, and we've heard the stories about this, that democracies face pressures, things such as economic transformations, growing economic inequality, declining social mobility, growing economic gaps between big cities and smaller places. That's one big factor that all democracies face. We also have seen major technological upheavals. We all know about that. not only social media, but now AI as well. We know about demographic changes, increasingly diverse societies, which in many ways may be opportunities, but also represent opportunities for demagogues sometimes to go after segments of the population as our societies become more diverse. All of this has meant that many established political parties in our democracies have gotten weaker, and this has opened the door for populist authoritarians in all of our democracies, Western Europe and the United States. In the United States, the expression of that populism has been the MAGA movement, the core of Donald Trump's base, the Make America Great movement. This represents about 30% of America's voters. So today, Donald Trump's approval rating is about 34%. This is the core of his base. What's interesting is that this same number, 30%, is about the same percentage of the electorate that often votes for populist parties in Western Europe, whether one's talking about the AfD in Germany, the Sweden Democrats. Across Western Europe, we have a very similar dynamic. Reaction to increasingly diverse society, reaction to cultural change, reaction to economic stagnation. But again, here's the thing, the United States and Western Europe are actually quite similar in this respect. This 30% is a near constant across all of our democracies. Germany, Italy, Sweden, Netherlands, France, the United Kingdom. Yet in those places, democracy has remained much more robust, facing challenges, but nonetheless remained more robust. So the point I want to make here is that what makes the US distinctive is not its voters. American voters aren't that different from West European voters. That's a broad similarity. The way I like to think about this is that America's populists aren't particularly popular. They're just very powerful. And so we have to think about why might that be the case. And I think there's two main reasons. The first has to do with political leaders, and the second has to do with political institutions. And as I work through this explanation, you can begin to think about what this implies for Germany, for Europe as well. So let me first talk about leaders. One of the oldest lessons if one studies democratic breakdown throughout history in the 1920s and 30s in Europe, the 1960s and 70s in Latin America, is that democracy often dies not at the hands of its obvious enemies, but through the decisions of its supposed defenders. It's often mainstream political leaders operating within democratic institutions who, through a combination of opportunism, miscalculation, collusion with rising outsiders, abdicate their responsibilities. They think they can act this way and that they can manage a danger that's emerging on the scene. Or they think they have no other choice. This is what I think of as a logic of abdication, or Selbstaufgabe, I guess I would say. This is a logic that I think leaders in the United States have fallen prey to that is in many ways responsible for what's happened over the past year. So let me just give you some examples going back actually to 2016. So back in 2016, when Donald Trump won the Republican nomination, not a single Republican leader did what theorists of democracy, including one Juan Linz, a great Spanish theorist of democracy, he argued that democratic leaders, when facing a threat, what they have to do is stand up to defend democracy and not align themselves with authoritarians. So in 2016, Donald Trump emerged on the scene, and Republicans who privately and sometimes publicly said that this figure is going to be a threat to democracy, nonetheless aligned with him when it came time for election. So there was no Republican members of the Senate, no Republican members of the Congress who endorsed Donald Trump's arrival at that time. Now, this sent a signal to voters that this was just a normal election between two candidates. This isn't always the case. You can think of the 2017 election in which Emmanuel Macron made it to the second round with Marine Le Pen. The conservative François Fillon, who was maybe closer to Le Pen than Macron, endorsed Macron nonetheless. So and put democracy ahead of party. Republican leaders in 2016 didn't do this. A second critical moment came, and Donald Trump eventually won, as we know. A second critical moment came on January 6th, 2021. This was the assault on the Congress, the violent assault on the Congress, an effort to block the peaceful transfer of power. 10 members of the House of Representatives who were Republicans voted to impeach Donald Trump after this. 7 Republican senators voted to convict. This is the most ever in an effort to impeach a president in American history. But this meant that over 200 Republican members of the House of Representatives and 43 Republicans voted against impeachment. So although it was very obvious to everybody this was an assault on Congress, they didn't vote to impeach. The leader of the Republicans in the US Senate, Mitch McConnell, gave a famous speech on the floor of the Senate in which he said, again, a Republican, he said that Donald Trump is morally and practically responsible for this attack on our Congress. But he said, I'm not going to vote to impeach him because we can leave this up to the courts to solve. You can contrast this with what happened in Brazil, when Brazil, sometimes Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, has been called by the New York Times as the Trump of the tropics. He also organized an attack on the Congress and the parliament buildings and government buildings after he was voted out of office. Or what would happen, and immediately after this, he was removed from politics. His conservative allies did not stand by him. Similarly, in South Korea, when President Yoon, just 2 years ago, last year, declared martial law, he was immediately impeached, removed from office. So this is, in fact, how strong democracies deal with authoritarian threats, is the allies of the offending person separate themselves with the offending person. Now, this hasn't happened in the United States, and since 2025, we continue to see the same process, where the Republican Party has legitimated, emboldened, and empowered anti-democratic forces. So at these 3 critical junctures, 2016, 2021, and 2025. But you may still ask, well, why has this happened? Why is this happening? Why are Republican leaders doing this? And I think a major contributing factor here is something that you all know about, which is the idea of a memory culture, the notion of Erinnerungskultur. Now, you all know in Germany, history is not locked away in museums, it's taught in schoolrooms and classrooms and Bundestag debates. It's not a culture of guilt, as it's sometimes portrayed. I think of it as a democratic muscle memory. When anti-democratic forces are on the march, then society has to react to this, understanding the threat that society faces. So, just a couple of years ago, in 2024, when the news reports came out about the gathering in Potsdam to deport citizens of migration background in Germany, there was a massive uprising in Germany, where people from all segments of life marched in the streets. And I have to say, I, as a political scientist, I was incredibly impressed by this. Big cities and small towns, trade union leaders spoke out, church leaders spoke out, business leaders spoke out, students spoke out. I was doing interviews with people who participated in this, and was met with a banker who said, for the first time in my life, I participated in a protest. So this kind of cross-sector mobilization is essential for democracy. And it's been much rarer in the United States over the last year. Now, there have been no kings marches, you may have heard about in the United States. But among America's political leaders and civic leaders, democracy has often been taken for granted. And its protection has just been left often to the courts. Political leaders, civic leaders, so and I have in mind here the heads of law firms, CEOs, the heads of media companies, university presidents, in the year 2025 were too quiet. You may ask, well, why was this the case? And I think one reason is that America lacks the kind of memory culture that maybe Germans have, or that other countries, South Koreans have. Americans tell themselves a story about their past that's very different. So I have a colleague at Harvard named Brandon Terry. He has a wonderful book that's just been published this year called Shattered Dreams, Infinite Hope. And he names this problem. He says that what happens in America, it's a book about the history of the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 1950s. And he makes the point that Americans tell themselves a story that the arc, to use Martin Luther King's language, the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice. We kind of think that the arc of the moral universe tends towards democracy. That the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s was heroic, triumphant, and in some sense already won. He calls this a romantic vision of history. That our democratic victories are in the bank, they're safe, unshakable. And this is very much accompanied with the idea that our checks and balances is a system that will work automatically, that will always work. Now the problem, and Brandon Terry makes this point, is that this kind of romantic view of history breeds a kind of passivity. It's a kind of overconfidence in our history and in our institutions. And it misunderstands how institutions operate. Institutions don't operate automatically. They're not a machine that run on their own. They're operated by people, leaders, civic leaders, political leaders, who have to defend democracy. And what Brandon Terry argues is that what we need in the United States is what he calls a tragic vision of history. That is a memory that reckons with defeat. A memory that refuses nostalgia, on the one hand, to say, well, everything will work out, but on the other hand, also rejects what he calls nihilism, which is to say that our democracy is doomed, everything is over, the game is rigged, we give up. And so there can be too much, there can be democratic overconfidence, and there can also be democratic fatalism. Both of them end up in the same position, which is a kind of position of passivity. And my understanding of German memory culture is that it somehow finds a way between these two. Now, I'm not saying this is a perfect solution, but I think there is a way in which this does build a kind of resilience. It's a kind of resilience that in some sense is missing in other democracies, in particular the United States. And this leads political leaders, another way to put this is that an autocrat doesn't need to seize power with weapons if people in power cede power. That is, they grant power. There's this great German concept for this, vorauseilende Gehorsam. In an environment in which you're overconfident in your institutions, or in an environment where you think your institutions are doomed, either way, this breeds passivity. So that's and I think too many American leaders suffer from this, with overconfidence in our institutions. The second source of vulnerability have to do less with leaders and more to do with America's political institutions. And it's in particular something that many of us correctly, I think, venerate and respect, which is the US Constitution. The Constitution is a remarkable document. There's much to like about the US Constitution. It protects liberties and does contain really great sources of strength and self-correction. But we also have to remember it's the oldest written constitution in the world. And some of its features reflect that age. Some of its features vastly overrepresent rural areas, for example, and also vastly overrepresent political minorities. Now, that might sound counterintuitive. Democracy, as we know, is not just about majority rule, it's also about protecting political minorities. It's absolutely essential. But it is also true in the United States we have a constitution in which it's harder for majorities to rule or govern than in any democracy in the world. So the Electoral College, the United States is the only democracy in the world where we still use an Electoral College for selecting our presidents. And what this Electoral College system means is that it's often the case, can happen and has happened in recent decades, where the loser of the election becomes the president. The Democratic Party has won the popular vote for the presidency 7 out of the last 9 elections. Republicans have only won the popular vote twice since 1988. And as I tell my teenage daughters, this is only 2 times since Taylor Swift was born. Just to give a little perspective here. But they've only won twice since Taylor Swift was born, but they've governed half the time. So this gives you a bit of a sense of it. The US Senate, a little bit like the Bundesrat, with equal representation for every state, no matter the size, distorts politics. The state of Wyoming has 500,000 citizens. The state of California has 40 million citizens. They each have 2 senators. The federal judiciary, we have a judicial system which in some sense overrepresents past generations, because we have the only federal judicial system in the world that has neither term limits nor a retirement age. So these justices appointed in one generation can live into another generation. So this also creates problems. So all of this, and the final point I would just say is the US Constitution, and this explains why we are in the situation they're in, is the hardest constitution in the world to change. It's been only amended 27 times in 237 years. If you contrast this with the Norwegian Constitution, which is the world's second oldest continuous written constitution, it's been amended over 300 times. Now, each of these features is unique, and you might think, well, some of these things are not a big problem, but you add all of them up in the US Constitution, it's hard to change, overrepresents particular regions, overrepresents political minorities. And although it was a revolutionary document when it was written in a pre-democratic age. And it was designed in part to protect against too much rule by the majority. That's right, but it sort of generated the opposite problem, which is that majorities often can't govern at all. Now, why does all of this matter? You might say, well, it worked pretty well for all this time. Why am I complaining about this now? Well, the problem is, here's the consequences, that 30% that's a constant across all of our democracies, propelled by dissatisfaction, non-responsiveness of our institutions, it's been able to use those institutions to gain power. So the 30% in Germany and Europe is often marginalized. It either has no access to power or it's in power in coalitions. And so in many ways, many European systems with proportional systems allow for this 30% to be moved to the margins of politics. Now, I'm not saying that politicians shouldn't address the 30%. The job of politicians is to figure out how to win voters, how to win that 30% of the vote. But at the end of the day, you'd rather have an authoritarian out of power than in power. And I think the politicians that are elected by that 30% today have put American democracy at risk. So again, what all of this means is that the German system is certainly not perfect. The system in Germany, the next year and the next 6 months is going to be tested. Just this fall, there will be regional elections in Eastern Germany. And so far, the system has worked at keeping authoritarians out of power. Will regional elections change this? I don't know. I mean, invite me back next year and we can talk about this. But so far, at least, this system has proven superior at keeping the same kinds of politicians out of power. In the United States, the Republican Party, the core of the third, gets around 47% of the vote and can win the presidency. The Republican Party doesn't need to win majorities to win the presidency. And so because of that, the whole logic of democracy is a kind of system of self-correction. It's a little bit like a business firm. If you can't compete, you come up with a new business strategy, or a soccer team, football team. If you can't compete, you come up with a new strategy. If you lose, you have to come up with a new strategy. In the United States, it's quite easy for a party that doesn't win a majority of the vote to keep running on the same strategy, because it actually does gain power because of the distortions of our system. If the Republican Party or the Democratic Party in the United States had to actually win real majorities, they'd face much greater pressure to reform. So again, the point here I'm making is that our institutions have left the US in some ways vulnerable. Now, given these diagnoses, what I want to do now is to discuss what should be done. That was the promise of my introduction, in both the US and in Europe. And I can say that different strategies are certainly necessary in different societies. But there is one way in which, for all of their imperfections, when I look at Europe, and I spend a lot of time in Europe, I think what this suggests is that one major source of change could come through reforming America's democratic institutions, a democratic reform movement. And you may think, well, this is really difficult in the United States, how difficult it is to change the US Constitution, but the US has done this before. You think here of the Reconstruction era in American history after the US Civil War, when Congress seized power away from the president in this period after the Civil War, this is the 1870s, was a president that kind of was like Trump, a kind of character that people didn't really respect. Andrew Johnson was his name, a very conservative court. The Congress essentially took power and implemented major reforms, constitutional amendments. The 14th Amendment, which guaranteed political equality, introduced the word equality in the US Constitution for the first time. The 15th Amendment, which guaranteed voting rights. Similar movement came at the beginning of the 20th century in the face of concentrated economic and political power of the Gilded Age, very similar to the current age in the United States. In the face of that kind of crisis, there was a burst of institutional innovation, a movement called the Progressive Movement, and suddenly the US Constitution was amended very quickly, 4 times in 7 years. The 16th Amendment created the federal income tax. The 17th Amendment made US senators directly elected by people rather than appointed. The 18th Amendment brought the prohibition of alcohol. Not all of these amendments were great, but that was one as well. The 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. There was a whole series of other reforms, antitrust, competition law, the secret ballot, referenda. There was other reforms. The point is, this is a period of great democratic energy and innovation. And so many of the things that we say the U.S. Constitution is this great Constitution that's been around forever. Many of the things that people like about the U.S. Constitution were added only after lots of struggle and lots of effort to reform the Constitution, after many years of reform efforts. And it renewed American democracy when it needed it. And this in many ways allowed the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt to come to pass. Without those reforms, this wouldn't have happened. So the point I'm making is that as hard as the process may be, we need a reinvigorated movement to further democratize our constitutional structures, to make institutions in the United States more responsive to majorities. Now again, the Constitution is hard to change, but this reform agenda should be on the political agenda in the United States. Now, what about Europe? And so I want to talk about two warnings that come from this story that I've told you about the United States. Two lessons, I would say, from America's last decade. Warning number one is do not try to co-opt demagogues. So as I said, beginning in 2015, Republican leaders believed they could tame America's populist demagogue by embracing him. They believed cooperation would give them control. This was catastrophically short-sighted. Winston Churchill, the former British Prime Minister, once warned that appeasement, so what is this in German? Bewichtigung, is feeding a crocodile, hoping to be the last one eaten. This is what has happened in the United States. The attempt to appease, to co-opt, backfired. And so I would say the lesson for Europe is don't try appeasing demagogues. Now again, consider how Germany deals with its own challenges and German political parties. Many parties and establishment parties have begun to wonder whether the so-called Brandmauer, the firewall, is worth it. Is it the right tactic? Isn't it backfiring? Is it really working? And I'm not sure if it's working, but I have to say that we should pay attention to the lessons of the United States. So far at the national level, the German parties have done something that American political parties could not do. And even at the local level, there has been less cooperation than people often think. We did an analysis at the Wissenschaftszentrum in Berlin, where we looked at all the levels of cooperation across Germany's Kreise. And up until 2024, there was actually not as much cooperation as people often think. Should this be sustained? I'm not sure. It's possible. There is this alternative story that people say, which is that maybe cooperation could appease, could moderate anti-democratic forces, anti-system forces. Maybe, we can find cases where that has happened. But I would say the American experience suggests that this is risky. It's a risk, in my view, that's not worth taking, given the stakes of what's at stake. So that's the first warning. Don't try to co-opt demagogues. Warning number two is don't fear institutional change. Now, I think in the United States, we fear the innovation of our democratic institutions, our constitutional structures. There's almost a kind of religious respect for our constitutional structures, and to think that, we can't touch them, we can't change them. The American founding fathers themselves were very aware that the Constitution is going to need amendment over time. We venerate our Constitution and treat it as if it's too fragile. Now, in Europe, I'd say the problem is different. The German basic law has been amended dozens of times. The fear of this kind of democratic change is not really the issue. I think there's a different kind of institutional paralysis that I sometimes see, and I think it more has to do with economic policy. There's a sense that there's a fear of maybe economic change, or a sense that we don't know quite how to change the economy. I think most political leaders, read Mario Draghi's report. There was a 400-page report published in 2024 with 176 proposals to revitalize European economy. There was prescription, 800 billion euros per year in new investment, common borrowing for common projects. People seem to be aware that this is necessary, but the question of how to implement these reforms seem very difficult. And one constraint in particular, I think, is the constraint of fiscal rules in the European Union that make reform difficult. So these are the kinds of areas where institutional reform in Europe is necessary. And one particular constraint that has hampered German political development, I would say, in the first quarter century quarter 25 years of this century has been the role of the debt brake in Germany. Now, actually, we had Olaf Scholz come to Harvard, and I sat on stage with him, and I asked him, do you think the debt brake was a mistake? And he said, no. So he disagrees with me on this. But I think that one can't, it's certainly the case that public investment has lagged, infrastructure crumbles, that Zeitenwende, after the Russian invasion, seemed to be an opportunity to open up this. But what is very clear from the literature and the research on radical right parties is that modern democracies must be able to deliver tangible goods for their citizens, infrastructure that works, which in turn funds economic policies that deliver to citizens. And again, the best evidence very, very much shows that radical right parties do well where infrastructure lags behind. There's a political scientist, a Dutch political scientist, Catherine de Vries, who has a book called The Symphony of Discontent, and she makes this very clear, that fiscal austerity often fuels the success of authoritarian populists. So voters who are hurt by retrenchment or have the perception that institutions aren't delivering for them grow disillusioned with democratic institutions. So an unwillingness to invest in public infrastructure, even in the face of serious challenges, isn't just bad economics. I think it's also bad, dangerous politics. So again, the lesson I would say, although the kinds of institutional reforms that are necessary are different in the United States, don't be fearful of these kinds of institutional reforms. Now, I want to conclude, though, by noting a couple of things. I said at the beginning that I would not only end on the kind of word of warning, but also say there's some positive lessons to be learned from the US. As I've said, Europe and the United States face similar challenges. The sources of the challenges may be slightly different. I think America has proven fragile to democratic decay because of elite abdication, as I've said, because of a thin memory culture, because of antiquated institutions. And in this respect, I actually think Europe has proven more resilient. I sometimes think, we have to stop and think of Greece. The fact that Greece survived the economic crisis of 2007, 2008, and the austerity politics that followed with its democracy intact was a major achievement. Underappreciated achievement, I would say. Now, I have to say, though, that this resilience does not mean invulnerability. And there are these real warnings from the United States. But again, the positive story. Let me end with the positive story. So there's a positive story in the pushback against Trumpism that has emerged in 2026. There's a warning from 2025, no elite abdication, efforts at co-optation. There's a positive lesson from 2026. And I find it to be an inspiring story. It gives me some optimism about the United States. So American civil society that was so quiet in 2025 began to push back in 2026. And a key turning point, in my view, may have come, we'll see, when the Trump administration's effort faltered in Minneapolis, Minnesota, at the beginning of 2026, February 2026. So you may remember in January 2026, immigration authorities, often with masks on, with weapons, arrived in the city of Minneapolis. And they targeted the city of Minneapolis. I don't know if people been to Minneapolis. Anybody here been to Minneapolis before? Okay, yeah, good. They targeted Minneapolis because, in part, it seems, because of the high number of Somali immigrants who live in Minneapolis, a large Muslim population. We thought this would be politically useful. But I think it turns out they chose the wrong city. 2 citizens, as you all know, were tragically shot by immigration authorities. But ultimately, the Trump administration had to retreat from this project. And it was in many ways, I think, the first major policy defeat of the Trump administration, and many things have contributed to declining approval ratings for the Trump administration. But this was, I think, potentially a major turning point. Now, what met these that they had to retreat from this project in Minneapolis, and what made them retreat was not just thousands of brave individuals in the streets. It also wasn't a single political leader. The mayor of Minneapolis was particularly convincing. It was really civil society. And by that, what I mean is a network of organizations, neighbors, religious communities, legal aid clinics, immigrant rights groups, labor unions, people in these organizations who had built relationships with each other long before the immigration authorities arrived, long before the moment of crisis. This is what the political scientist Robert Putnam calls bridging social capital. That is, social capital across groups, across the normal divides. So when ICE, the immigration authorities, arrived in Minneapolis, many immigrants who were there in Minneapolis perfectly legally retreated to their homes. We heard of stories of children who are afraid to go to school, or parents who are afraid to send their children to school, adults who are afraid to go to the supermarket, elderly people who are afraid to go to the hospital. And what happened was that this network of organizations that was already there kicked into action. Labor unions, white men who are in labor unions, accompanied school children to school. Evangelical churches helped Muslim immigrants. Other adults helped migrants, families, and their children to hospitals, delivered groceries. Legal aid groups helped defend many of the immigrants and people who are being unfairly attacked. And again, all of this happened because long before ICE arrived, Minneapolis was a city in which groups, organizations already existed across class and religious divides. They already had these relationships. And so what this suggests to me is that there is really power in this kind of civil society. And the kind of broader lessons I would say is when facing these kinds of attacks, number one, you don't have to push back on your own as an individual. You can push back as part of groups. When you're in a group, you're more powerful and more effective. And number two, I would say the lesson of Minneapolis suggests you need to build bridges across obvious divides, like religion, class, region, before moments of crisis come. I mean, the fact that you had Christian groups and Muslims cooperating before this happened was really critical. Number three, and this is as individuals, I think it's important for us to all decide what our own personal red lines are. I mean, I've heard people say you should write down on a piece of paper what things you find unacceptable. Because what often happens if you don't do that is people very quickly normalize whatever is happening around them. And something that you would have previously found unacceptable, you now you say is okay. So you should have your own personal red lines and be able to talk about them publicly. And then fourth, and this is also a lesson from Minneapolis, is bring your own expertise and professional skills to bear through organizations. And so, if you are a professional, a lawyer, you can do pro bono or free legal work. If you're a doctor, you can provide aid in this way. If you are a tax accountant, you can volunteer your services to civil society organizations. If you're a student, you have writing ability or technical, analytical skills, put that to work in organizations. The point is use your capacities that you have in ways that really can make a difference. So in the end, I would say, as tragic as the story in Minneapolis was, there seems to be kind of a lesson in that story, which is that there's a lot of power in groups. The people in groups are more powerful than people as individuals, and they pushed back against this incredible authoritarian assault in Minneapolis. And at the end of the day, I think that's how democracy is defended. Thank you very much.
Weitere Infos und aktuelle Veranstaltungen finden Sie auf unserer Webseite und unserem Instagram.